Ladies and gentlemen, welcome at the ICMM Centennial Talks 2021. Live from our studio in Schelle, near Antwerp. But it's also a hybrid event, because in the meantime, while we have a small, let's say small audience here in our studio, we have a huge audience from all around the world. So to those who are watching right now, I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or maybe even good night, and thank you for watching. Our small live studio audience, can I please have a reaction from the live studio audience? There you go. It's a pleasure to see you here, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to be an amazing afternoon. And well, due to COVID, we couldn't organize a huge event. Normally, it would have been with hundreds of people in the same venue. COVID decided otherwise, but I assure you, we will make it up to you next year. That's a promise. To officially start the ICMM Centennial Talks 2021, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to have the opening address from the Director General of the 44th ICMM World Congress 2021 and 2022, Brigadier General Edwin Dont. And may I please ask everyone to please rise for the Belgian national anthem.
Mr. Chairman of the ICMM, General Stettbacher, Mr. Vice Chairman, Admiral Smith, Mr. Secretary General of the ICMM, General Lehre, distinguished guests in your respective titles, ranks, degrees, and capacities, ladies and gentlemen all over the globe, together with the organizing committee, and also on behalf of Event Masters, the professional Congress organizer, I warmly welcome you. I warmly welcome you to this exceptional hybrid event covering almost 15 standard world time zones. Altogether, you are with approximately 300 plus participants, digitally connected, but also live, physically present here in the XL studio in Schelle, halfway between our capital Brussels and the amazing city of Antwerp. Ladies and gentlemen, for its 44th and at the same time Centennial Anniversary edition, the ICMM chose a return home to one of its founding members, Belgium. Note that this very week too, starting from 2 days ago, our country is also the host for the 2021 Road Cycling World Championships, once again exactly 100 years after the very first edition here in Flanders in 1921, while that region was still recovering from the horrors of the Great War and the Spanish flu. Dear audience, it need not to be said, but a centennial jubilee, you can only celebrate it once. And that's why, waiting till the 44th World Congress in September next year, we decided to already host you today in a half-day hybrid conference event. And so we have named this event the ICMM Centennial Talks as a tribute to all who have played a role in the worldwide success of ICMM in promoting peace. Peace by the free exchange of medical knowledge and international medical cooperation between armed forces medical services worldwide. Together with our scientific committee and our budget expert, to all of whom I owe a great debt of gratitude. Dear fellow teammates, Frank, Kat, Jean-Paul, Damien, Jean-Charles and Christophe, many, many, many thanks indeed for your invaluable support during these difficult times. So all of us, we put together an exciting scientific program. But it's true, tightly embedded in a well-directed screenplay. We have selected a fabulous faculty of 5 high-quality speakers, and they are more than ready to deliver their talk in a few minutes. And then, this is not just a webinar. This is a combined digital and live experience. And in my opinion, no matter how, this is a promising format for future large scientific conferences. And all that had to be originally dressed up and combined with the mandatory ICMM ceremonial events, elements, like a national anthem, a flag parade, an official speech, etc. After more or less 1.5 hours of TED Talk-like content, you will enjoy afterwards an open mic with the speakers and a lively panel discussion. And while the digital attendees follow the full event online from the comfort of their seats in their office or at home, we, here in the studio, we plan to end in beauty with a networking opportunity, having the chance, after so many months, to share face-to-face your experience, exchange information, or simply catching up with peers and colleagues. Ladies and gentlemen, nowadays, mental and physical functioning in the defense forces have become the topic not only of clinicians, such as emergency doctors and trauma surgeons, or psychiatrists, or infectiologists, and not only of mental health practitioners and physiotherapists, but also of a broad, multidisciplinary community, ranging from occupational health and safety physicians to engineers, from nutritional experts to sports scientists, from data analysts to human factor specialists. And thus, the first 2 contributions under the Congress themes, from rehab to prehab and from shell shock to mental fitness, underline sharply clear that the emphasis of defense health nowadays is definitely shifting steadily from military health care towards prevention, towards screening, towards performance, increased mind-body interaction, and thus overall maintaining positive health. This having said, war remains an amazing learning environment, with each conflict pushing trauma and military medicine forward. The Great War of 1914-18 brought far-reaching advances to the field of military medicine and medicine in general. It acted actually as a giant field trial. Let me just recall the progress of wound care and especially wound infection management with extensive wound debridement and disinfection with sodium hypochlorite, the known Decans solution, which has been considered as one of the greatest discoveries of the war. Other surgical advances were the usage of splinting, employing the Thomas splint, and even so, the beginning of reconstructive surgery of bones and joints. So in many ways, war and conflict are the perfect laboratory for trauma research and military medical research in general. That is why we also wanted to include a couple of lectures dedicated to genuine advances in military health care. Both Congress themes, the battle against infections with a focus on phage therapy, and forward surgery, focusing on the acute hospital management of explosion injuries, will highlight some of those advances. To complete the program, and by way of an overview and resume, our last invited speaker will showcase global health engagement activities, initiatives, programs, and that while touching upon all the 4 main Congress themes previously highlighted. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot wait any longer to listen to our speakers. So, let's go for it and start with the ceremony.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I have a big round of applause indeed for the ICMM Dance Ensemble? The ICMM already exists 100 years, ladies and gentlemen. That is clear. It was founded in 1921. It's 2021, so that's 100 years. But how did it all start? What was the focus of the ICMM in 1921 when it was still very, very young? And since then, has it changed? That's a question that we want an answer to. And how has this organization adapted itself during the past century? Well, we go to a pre-recorded virtual presentation done by the chairman of ICMM, Major General Andreas Stedbacher. He will be doing this presentation after you have listened to a wonderful piece of music that has been specially made for this ICMM Centennial talk. It is the ICMM March, and this is a world premiere, ladies and gentlemen. So, enjoy the march, and then we will listen to Major General Andreas Stedbacher.
In arduis fortis et fidelis, in difficult times strong and faithful. Generals, admirals, air commodores, dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor and pleasure to address you with a few words on the centennial celebration of the International Committee of Military Medicine, ICMM. By the time the Western Front's guns fell silent exactly 1 century ago, 10 million soldiers had died in World War I, 20th century's first global catastrophe, which nonetheless seeded modern conceptions of a liberal international order. World War I, and especially the dramatic development of the Spanish flu pandemic at the end of the war, which was initially considered to be part of a new biological warfare program and a weapon of mass destruction, had revealed the importance of a closer cooperation between the armed forces medical services worldwide to respond to concerns over the lack of care for victims during this conflict. In this context, Navy Captain William S. Bainbridge, medical doctor, and Major General Jules Wonken, medical doctor from Belgium, suggested at the 28th session of the Association of Military Surgeons of the United States, AMSUS, the creation of an international, neutral and impartial organization of all armed forces medical services to strengthen exchange of information and cooperation between military health services worldwide. Subsequently, the ICMM was established in 1921. The Belgian government supported the practical development of this concept, and the first International Congress of Military Medicine and Pharmacy, ICMPM, was held in July 1921 in Brussels, Belgium, in presence of King Albert I. The founding countries were Belgium, Brazil, France, Italy, Spain, Switzerland, and the United States. Since its founding, the ICMPM has always gathered military health services from all political blocs in uniform, including during the Cold War. VUCA world is dominating our lives with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Terrorist attacks, pandemics, natural and environmental disasters in the recent past have made it impressively clear to everyone how necessary and urgent concepts and measures in military and disaster medicine are to cope with such major events. The COVID-19 pandemic has lately reached a new dimension with thousands of critically ill patients and deaths, and poses new, previously unknown challenges for civil and military medical professionals. This will have a lifetime impact on how military medicine will be conducted in the future. Novel coronavirus infection with a high transmissibility rate has caused untold damage and continues to bring loss and hardship to communities around the globe. The world's poorest continue to suffer from unequal access to life-saving medical tools and vaccines. The events of the past 20 months will have profound effects on medicine and military medicine for years to come. How do we prepare for threats? How do we organize the measures? And how do we organize alongside to make the system better for everyone? It's the total team effort that exemplifies military medicine's potential during the COVID-19 pandemic, also in terms of resilience. Perhaps more than ever before, we have pushed laboratories to deliver more results faster, and we have relied on our logisticians to figure out how to get vaccines delivered around the world. These are unprecedented facts. Every country has done an incredible effort to detect and mitigate the impact of the virus. What we have learned the most is that success against such calamities requires shared commitments and shared responsibilities. To deal with these challenges, we have to increase our resilience with awareness, anticipation, a sense of evolution, preparedness, readiness, and the ability to intervene. Even after 100 years, the main objective of the ICMM is to maintain and strengthen the bonds between military medical services personnel and to make networks work, using similar practices in operations and involving international cooperation. Our organization must continuously encourage activities where scientific and technical experience are shared by developing contacts and disseminating information with the scientific community, by providing best practices and standards, and by promoting scientific military medical activities more than ever in times of distress. This enables the pooling of resources and work experience of military medicine, both in theaters of operations and in support of civilian authorities in case of crisis, as experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. While the world is still reeling from the COVID-19 pandemic, all of us should already be prepared for the next one. The ICMM organization should play a major role to mediate and intercede between all member countries with the following goals. 1. Since pandemic and emerging international security situations are volatile, variable and unpredictable, the emphasis for policymakers is going to be on much improved information gathering and monitoring in order to anticipate the evolution of ongoing trends and to spot looming crises. 2. When emerging threats are spotted and analyzed, it is never too early to discuss them internationally. ICMM is the precise and perfect board of experts for these dialogues on emerging threats. 3. In terms of policy implementation and the sustaining organizations, the buzzwords will be adaptability, the ability to deal with changing issues and circumstances, and agility, the ability to make decisions and implement them rapidly. My call for action in our organization should continue to build a successful network in the meaning of the original spirit of ICMM. We need to go further by setting up a roadmap through recommendations for governments, armed forces, international organizations, and industry partners to take forward, working collectively and collaboratively to achieve ambitious targets for global health and well-being. We do not know when or from where the next threat will emerge, so we need to implement an everyday routine to work together between sectors and across national borders, not to be surprised by the exceptional event or even a black swan. Readiness in such situations means being ready for anything. Building our solid and resilient network for awareness, anticipation, sense of evolution, preparedness, readiness, and intervention will make us together strong to tackle whatever the future will challenge us with. Thank you very much for your attention and participation into that matter.
And thank you very much, Major General Stedbacher, for this speech. The ICMM, ladies and gentlemen, is a gift that must be treasured. It exists for 100 years, it must go on for at least 100 years more. Founded in a period of time that demanded a strong collaboration and structure after a world war that literally tore our society apart. Since then, of course, the world has radically changed. Like the Major General said it, now we live in VUCA times. Well, everything is just changing very, very fast. What is the impact of this changing environment on an organization like ICMM? Is it ready for the future? And for this, I would like to invite our next speaker on stage, the Secretary General, ICMM. Please welcome Major General Geert Lehre.
Mr. Chairman, Generals, Admirals, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I thank the Chairman for his brief historical review and his analysis, and I fully concur with the observation that some of the objectives of 100 years ago have lost none of their relevance. On the eve of the second century of ICMM, it seems to me appropriate to consider how we wish to deal with the valuable legacy left to us by our predecessors. What do member states expect from an international organization today? Should we keep the organization as it is? Or do you think changes are necessary? Do our working principles stand the test of time? If we look at organizational strategic adaptation and the relationship between organizations and their environments, how do we position ourselves in the dichotomy between environmental determinism and managerial choice or managerial voluntarism? In a conference paper on organizational adaptation and survival, Giampaolo Abbatecola, an Italian professor from the Department of Management and Law at the Tor Vergata University of Rome, discusses this dichotomy. He refers to Michael Lawless and Linda Finch-Teegarden from the University of Colorado, who once stated that two dimensions of organization-environment relations have often been the subject of research. One is the fit between an organization's strategy and the environment in which it operates. Basically, it involves the question of whether some types of strategy are better suited to certain kinds of environments and whether others simply should not be followed. The other dimension is management's role in shaping an organization's direction. What is determining the success and survival of an organization? Managerial choice, also called managerial voluntarism, or environmental forces, also referred to as determinism. What is preferable? Determinism is an orientation that views the environment as determining the organizational structure. Determinists mainly see organizations as fundamentally reactive. Managerial voluntarists assume that organizations' top decision makers are basically independent of the external environment and that their role, as a consequence, is fundamentally proactive in shaping corporate goals. But determinism and voluntarism can also be seen as variables whose relationship is dynamically changing. Organizations can be either proactive or reactive to environmental pressures within the various stages of their life cycle. Thus, the intensity of determinism and voluntarism as competitive forces can be different and changeable over time. Ladies and gentlemen, as just mentioned by our chairman, we live in a VUCA world, and the challenges posed by such a world explain why we have spent the last few months revising ICMM's vision, mission, and strategy, and reflecting on your role in shaping ICMM's future. On the one hand, it is important to maintain fundamental principles and values. On the other hand, we know that permanent adaptation to our environment and creative change, in a sense of shape your own future, is necessary for survival. If you ask me which way to go after 100 years of existence, my answer is conservation in a context of necessary permanent change. Conservation of principles and values should not be an obstacle to changes in structure and in functioning, assuming that such changes can be both reactive and proactive. Personally, I think that we must strengthen our proactivity, and we should definitely work on ICMM's agility, by which I mean the ability for the organization to respond rapidly to whatever occurs. Last but not least, we need to speed up the rollout of a new communication strategy. As Secretary General, I think that I can affirm that the Secretariat General and all the other entities within ICMM will do their best to keep the dynamic going. And I hope that the organization will also be able to count on your creativity, your commitment and engagement to set the way forward. The initiative to organize these Centennial Talks as a commemoration of 100 years ICMM and as an intermediate step towards the World Congress next year is undoubtedly a good example of entrepreneurship and commitment. May the Centennial Talks not only be a tribute to the founding fathers and to all those who have dedicated themselves to ICMM in the past, but also inspire us all as we look to the future. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, and I hope you will enjoy the Centennial Talks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, General Geert Leyre, and I think ICMM is ready for the future, ladies and gentlemen, and ready to go for another 100 years. Now, I have a question for you, here in the audience, but also the people at home. Who maybe had the New Year's resolution to go to the gym more often? Please raise your hand. Who had this New Year's resolution? Come on, be honest with yourself. Yes? Okay. Maybe at home also people tend to believe that, well, if I go to the gym and I train, then I will be in shape. Who likes to run? Here in the audience, someone, maybe at home, you like to run? Yeah. And maybe you had the idea, after a long run, the next morning, you had the idea, maybe I shouldn't have done that. My legs hurt. Something is wrong. Well, then you can imagine what it must be for these young recruits in the army who have to run, who have to march, who have to every day be on their feet. And the impact of running and marching causes overuse pain syndromes. You can, of course, go into rehab, but is that effective? Maybe we have to move from rehab to prehab, and to emphasize the role of sports medicine in military medicine. And we're going to do that with Lieutenant Colonel Professor Dr. Wes Zimmermann. He's a primary care sports medicine physician working for the Royal Netherlands Army in the city of Utrecht, and he is specializing in the treatment of overuse injuries in the lower extremities. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Professor Dr. Wes Zimmermann.
Thank you. I would like to start my presentation with acknowledging my employer, the Royal Netherlands Army, and I would also like to declare my affiliation with USUHS, the Department of Military and Emergency Medicine in Bethesda, Maryland. And of course, in the beginning of a presentation, it's important to declare no commercial relationships. This is strictly military business. From rehab to prehab, in this short introduction on sports medicine in the military, I would like to discuss with you 4 points. First, sports medicine in the military, a very brief look into the past. Second, rehab, which in my definition is treating overuse injuries. Third, prehab, the prevention of overuse injuries. Is it possible? And fourth, sports medicine in the military. What's in the future? A brief look into that. So, looking into the past, I will not go back as far as the old Greek, but I will go back to the beginning of the Olympics, because I think modern Olympics, modern sports, and modern sports medicine have evolved in conjunction since the start of the Olympics 1896. And there's one example of the cooperation between sports medicine and military medicine that I want to highlight. It's from 1928, the year the Olympics were in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. German scientists were looking for ways to best select airline pilots and fighter pilots. And they figured that the closest athletes would be those that are diving from the 10-meter platform. And here you see those scientists, and they are recording the heartbeat, and they are asking psychological questions to this springboard and platform diver, and they try to deduce conclusions for selecting the best fighter pilots. So if we're talking from the point of view from sports medicine, what kind of overuse injuries are there in the military? Well, obviously they are related to those activities that are done the most, which is running in sports shoes, but also running in military boots. And not to forget, marching, road marching. Many people don't realize that road marching is even a higher risk of overuse injuries than running is. And last of all, let's not forget, soldiers do all of these activities in many times with a backpack, with additional loading. So, as promised, I will focus a little bit on exercise-related leg pain, because overuse injuries are most common to the lower extremities. Here you see a picture of the leg, and you see the two most common bones in the leg, the tibia and the fibula, and you see the statement made by a British scientist made in 2015. He says, overuse injuries of the leg, exercise-related leg pain, has the greatest impact on training, accounting for almost 20% of all days spent in rehabilitation. So these injuries to training soldiers are not scarce. They are very common, and they are costly, and they cost time and effort to heal and to bring the soldier back to his duties. So what is specific about the sports medicine approach? Specific about the sports medicine approach is thinking about how can this activity be done differently? Is maybe the biomechanics of executing this sport activity, can it be improved? Many of you maybe think that running is running. Everybody knows how to run. You can't do it bad or poorly. The answer is yes, you can. And here you see some of the recent evidence. In 2012, the very first publication by an American physical therapist, back in the day, Major Diebel, she wrote, I have 10 patients with exercise-related leg pain. They are all coming up for surgery. But before the surgery, I will teach them how to run better. The result was none of the 10 cadets needed surgery. They all returned to duty, and by learning how to run differently, they were cured. So then the next part in the evidence was a study in 2017 by Davis, also from the United States. And she was the first to write, listen, this is really an epidemiological fact. If you run in the wrong technique, you will get overuse injuries. Before her work, people would always say, well, where's the proof? Where's the evidence? By now, in 2021, there's ample evidence. If you run in the wrong technique, you will get hurt. And of course, in my own work, treating patients in the Netherlands with exercise-related leg pain, I have been able, following the work by Diebel, where she included 10 patients, over the last few years, I've been able to publish studies on 150, 200 patients that were all very successful. Not the 100% that Diebel reported, but we are close at 70% success, no surgeries needed, return to duty. So some of you might say, well, changing the way I run is extremely difficult. I've been running all of my life. I'm not an athletic coach. I don't know how to teach this. I'm a doctor. Well, let me assure you, teaching how to run differently is very simple. You only need 3 cues. 1, change your foot strike from a heel strike to a forefoot strike. 2, make smaller steps and increase your cadence to 180 steps a minute. 3, stand up tall while running. Don't bend over, don't lean backwards. So then the next question is, well, can you show me a little bit of evidence? Can you show me some results? Yes, I can. This picture shows you the results of gait retraining. This in particular study was a group of 33 men. They had 5 lessons over a period of 3 months. It was not the only thing they had. They had other therapies. But the gait retraining reduced the vertical ground reaction forces during running. In the white, you see the sporting shoes, the boots. In the blue, you see the sporting shoes. What you might notice is that all of the columns are in the same direction. This means that you can change forces while running in sporting shoes, but you can also change with the same 3 cues running in military boots. There is one exception. There is one area where there is a huge white column sticking up. This is the forces under the midfoot in the boot. This explains why running in running shoes and in military boots will never be the same. Military boots are heavy and tight. So yes, you can run lighter in military boots, but it will never be the same and never be as nice as running in sporting shoes. So, moving on in time, now we're in 2021, gait retraining, learning to run differently as a therapy seems to be very promising for most of the overuse injuries of the lower extremity. Injuries of the knee, injuries of the leg, injuries of the Achilles tendon, and injuries of the heel. Let's turn to the third topic, prehab, the prevention of overuse injuries. Now, we talked about one overuse injury, the overuse injuries of the legs, but there are many. So it's obvious, and if you allow me, I will read this sentence. Musculoskeletal injuries are endemic within the military population, and they pose the greatest health problem facing military service members during both peacetime and combat operations. Musculoskeletal injuries and conditions are also the single greatest threat to military readiness. Cameron, 2014. So what this says is, most soldiers are not incapacitated by bullets, but they are incapacitated by sports injuries, even before they get to fight or during deployment. So it's very important that we find a way of preventing these overuse injuries. And we as doctors, we must try to explain to our colleagues and to military leadership how this can be done. Currently, there is a NATO research task group, number 283, and it's a multi-nation effort, and the members of this group have come up with a model to try to explain what is the best thing to do to prevent these overuse injuries. It must be clear to you that it's not simple, but it is possible. This model focuses on the injured soldier in the middle. And in the first circle around it are those risk factors for overuse injury that should be addressed first, first-order risk factors. In the second circle, there are those that should be addressed second order. And in the third circle, those that should be addressed thirdly. Let me give you an example. We are talking about overuse injuries. So the only factor that can be in the red circle is training load, because training load goes into overload. To give you an example, smoking is in the third ring. Smoking will cause that your fitness is less fitness is in the second order. Less fitness means that you are more likely to be overloaded, first circle. So, the goal of this model is to show you which factors should be addressed first and which factors can be addressed overall. Because all of the factors mentioned in this model by the NATO work group have been decided to be very valuable. So there's enough scientific evidence to address all of them. In summary, to prevent overuse injuries, it is possible. But if you do so, you must use a multifactorial intervention. In other words, doing just one thing is not enough. And you must come up with location-specific interventions, because it's clear that the solutions for one country are not the same as for another country, and that there are different circumstances with different populations and in different climates and in even different branches of the armed forces. But always, if you want to reduce overuse injuries, reduce training load first and reduce body-borne weight first. The fourth and final topic, sports medicine in the military. So, let's return to where we started. Sports medicine focuses on the athletes that try to prepare for competition. And military medicine focuses on warrior athletes who try to prepare for action on the battlefield. And let's try to learn again from sports medicine. So what is it that sports medicine tells these athletes to do? If you want to perform at the highest level, your preparation will most likely be years instead of months. And you must really gradually increase to maximal load. And this makes us kind of wonder, is a 3-month preparation, is that enough for a special forces guy? Why are our training sessions so short? Why must the load increase so fast? And also in sports, There's attention to details and the embedded scientists with the teams that help the coaches. All right. What does this mean for training and for prevention of injuries in the future? It means that individual training will be more important than group training to get that individual to the level where he needs to be in order to contribute to the team. Because ultimately, military action is always a team effort. But if you as an individual are not fit enough, you will not be able to contribute to the team. Van Tichelen, 2021, a famous Belgian sports medicine scientist. Coming to the take-home messages. Sports medicine and military medicine have a long history. Gait retraining is an example of an effective treatment in the military. Overuse injuries can be prevented, but it's not easy and you need multidisciplinary teams. And last of all, sports medicine in the future will remain important in military medicine because we can assist in promoting optimal task readiness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Colonel Zimmermann. Ladies and gentlemen, give him a big round of applause, of course. So there you go. Build it up slowly, ladies and gentlemen, to prevent injury when you go running. Also the people at home, be careful. The ICMM, ladies and gentlemen, celebrates its centennial. 100 years ago, it all started. And all of this to have a closer cooperation between the armed forces medical services worldwide. And I think that every one of you have seen the images of these soldiers in the big war, 1914, 1918. Those soldiers coming back from the trenches. And there was something going on. There was something wrong with them. Some of them reacted even to a word. If you said the word bomb, then they would just hide under a table and start shaking. And this was a phenomenon which was called shell shock. And symptoms were loss of memory, loss of vision, loss of smell and taste. And it had been documented before, because in the American Civil War, it was known as soldier's heart. And then we had the Vietnam War. And then for the very first time, there was the mentioning of trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And it was the first time that it was documented in DSM-3. So it was acknowledged as being something that was real and that was maybe treatable. But of course, soldiers aren't always on the battlefield, luckily. And then there's another risk lurking around, and that's burnout. And we have to go from this shell shock to mental fitness. And we're going to do this with Professor Dr. Lode Godderis. He's a full professor at the Center for Environment and Health of the University of Leuven. He investigates the impact of environment on health by unraveling the underlying epigenetic mechanism, and also the reverse, how health can affect work ability and disability. Please welcome Professor Dr. Lode Godderis.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope you're enjoying yourself as well. Indeed, I will be talking about mental health, and during a Centennial, we need to look back in the past, and would like indeed to show you the picture that Olivier was just describing. This is a soldier that came off the trenches in Flanders Fields, more or less 100 kilometers from here, by the way, where we are. And these soldiers were not physically injured, but they were mentally injured. They suffered from a disorder which is now considered to be a post-traumatic stress disorder. At that time, during the ICMM, most physicians and psychiatricians would rather be concerned about how to describe, to diagnose these disorders, and also try to understand. And in fact, one author, Charles Meyer, published in 1915 in The Lancet a paper describing 3 cases describing the symptoms that Olivier just had introduced to you. And he called it shell shock. Shells referring to the bombs that exploded close by the soldiers experiencing the mental health injuries he was reporting. And in fact, remarkably, he tried to understand and to describe the mechanisms underlying these effects he was observing. And he thought that the fact that the soldiers were so close to a blast that this caused a kind of brain trauma that could explain the mental health problems they were suffering from. So at that day, acute stressors were causing brain damage, which could lead and explain to the mental health issues these soldiers were experiencing. Fortunately, nowadays we live more in peaceful times, and the image has changed. However, common mental health disorders remain quite prevalent within the army. And this is now the picture that you will find on the internet. A military soldier sitting down on the ground with typical the hands around his head, referring to a syndrome he's suffering from, which we all know as burnout. Strange enough, also here, burnout, we do not exactly know what it is. The WHO has recently defined burnout as a work-related phenomenon. A phenomenon, not a syndrome, not a disease, it's a phenomenon, but it's work-related. So the WHO clearly referred to the job and the characteristics of a job that somebody is performing. WHO categorized or referred to three main symptoms that typically can be used to characterize burnout. The first symptom is emotional exhaustion. It's also the most important symptom. The second symptom is diminished personal accomplishment. You don't know how to perform your job anymore. And the last symptom is mental distance, cynicism. You take distance from the work you're not liking anymore. You do not know how to perform anymore. More recent research has indicated that there are also two other characteristics we probably could add to these three main symptoms, being cognitive and emotional discharge, facts that you are not being able to think very well anymore, and that you are not even able of controlling your emotions. So these are the key characteristics. But as I already indicated, if we look at the past and the science of mental health issues and problems described within the military, we mainly see papers about acute stress and the consequences like PTSD. I think the description of burnout within the army remains an emerging field, despite it is highly prevalent. And for that, I would like to introduce you a bit to what burnout is, how we can distinguish it from other common mental health disorders like depression, and try to understand the underlying mechanisms. And for that, I would like to use this complex figure. And let me take you to the upper top of this figure. There you see fatigue. I'm sure all of you working in the medical field, if you see and receive patients in your consultation room, fatigue is a very common complaint that could refer to different medical diseases, including mental health disorders. Studies indicate even that 1 on 3 consultations within general practitioners concern to some extent a fatigue-related problem. It's a very prevalent symptom. However, it's also very aspecific, so it's very difficult then to try to understand the underlying disease. But let me now zoom in into the common mental health disorders, in which, to the left, I think, for you, yes, you see depression, and that's considered as a mood disorder, characterized by anhedonia, loss of interest and appetite, and depressive mood symptoms. Depression considers all aspects of life, and in fact, as I indicated, is related to mood. If you go to the other side, we are seeing burnout. And burnout is a context, is related to specific context characteristics of a job. So it's a work-related disorder, which is linked with the characteristics of the job. The key characteristic is exhaustion. So you can consider it as an energy a depletion of energy, a loss of energy to perform well at job. But it's evident that despite the origin and the causes of both disorders are quite different, and also the treatment is quite different of the disorders, that they have quite some overlap among both of them. I refer, for example, to sleeping problems, the fatigue I mentioned earlier, not being able to function, perform well. So in that sense, it's quite difficult to make a differential diagnosis between depression on one hand and burnout on the other hand. And in my lab, we are trying to investigate the underlying epigenetic mechanisms. And epigenetic mechanisms refer to those inheritable changes that have an impact on the expression of a gene. Let me explain you that a bit better. Here in this graph, you see stressor. And when our body, our mind perceives stress, a hormone gets released by the HPA axis. And that hormone is a stress hormone we know very well, cortisol. Cortisol prepares our body and mind to respond to acute stressors so that we can respond effectively. However, cortisol is an acute stress hormone, so it will get released fast, but will disappear fast as well once the stressor is gone. So in that sense, cortisol is maybe not the ideal hormone, stress hormone, to monitor the impact of chronic stress on our body, and certainly not to diagnose stress-related disorders like burnout. In fact, what we see, for example, in PTSD, you maybe might expect higher cortisol levels. Well, studies seem rather to indicate that cortisol levels are lower in PTSD patients. And the same occurs in burnout. In fact, it's even more complex, because in burnout, what we do observe is that some studies indicate, in fact, higher cortisol levels in patients suffering from burnout. And we can explain that. More stress means a bigger release of stress hormones. However, like always in science, there are also plenty of other studies just showing the opposite, explaining that the HPA, by continuous stimulation of the HPA axis, leading it to exhaustion, that you get a decreased release of cortisol and decreased concentration of cortisol levels. So how can we now use this to better understand? As I indicated in our lab, we look at epigenetic mechanisms, more specifically DNA methylation. If a gene is methylated, that gene does not come to expression. If a gene is unmethylated, that gene can come to expression. So in that sense, our body and cells are able to activate and deactivate genes in order to respond to stressors in the immediate environment of the cell and our body. So that's how it works. These changes are relatively stable, which allows us then to study better the impact on long term and also study better the response to chronic stressors. And in fact, what we are trying to do is we have identified a set of genes involved in the relation of mood, in the regulation of the mood. A second set of genes concerns genes that are being activated or deactivated in response to stress. And a final gene is the BDNF gene, which you might know as the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a kind of maintenance gene of our brain. And let me show you now the results of a study we performed in burnout patients compared to control patients. And in the y-axis, actually, you see the symptoms, the mean score of the burnout scales we used. And what you see here is indeed, as you can expect, if people perceive more job stress, it will lead to a higher risk of developing burnout. However, this relation, this association seems to be moderated by a specific gene which plays a role in the mood, in the regulation of the mood, more specifically the serotonin transporter gene. And depending on the methylation state, you can see that the response to stress and the risk on burnout differs. So like that, we can make use of this knowledge to better understand the underlying mechanisms and hopefully be able on the long term to describe an epigenetic signature from depression and burnout, which would help us in the diagnosis of both disorders. I just gave now the example of a specific gene. But fortunately, we also dispose of more complex technologies, very advanced technologies, which we are calling omics technologies. And within the omics field, what we are trying to do is really to describe, to try to catch all the information we can get, for example, from the genes. So nowadays, by using arrays, we can identify the full genetic profile of an individual by genomics. In our field, in epigenetics, we are making use of techniques, epigenomics, to try to get and analyze the full epigenome of an individual. And also, yes, indeed, the proteins, the gene products, we also can try to identify by another exciting field, which is called proteomics. So in that sense, what we are trying to do, in fact, is to catch all the information and relate it to each other. And you can imagine that now we will dispose of plenty of data that we have very difficult to even interpret and analyze. But that might help us in understanding the development of the disease and develop better biomarkers. But I would like to ask you something. For now, I have been talking about the individuals, the complaints they have after experiencing acute and chronic stress. I also explained you a bit the biology and how we could use this to better diagnosis. But there's one thing we lack, and I think we should better implement as well in our practice to assess and make a clinical diagnosis. And this is the characteristics of our job. And it's not always negative, and that's why I like this model. This model is the job demands resources model. And the idea beyond this model is that our job can be characterized by job demands. For example, work pressure, conflicts, situations at work that drain the energy and could lead to the development of burnout. So having a good image of the job demands in somebody's job is quite important, not only for the prevention, but also for the later treatment. Because if you want to rehabilitate, help somebody to get back to work after burnout, you will not only have to treat the patient, but also the work and work environment. Fortunately, our work gives a lot of energy as well, which we are then calling job resources. And typical examples is the perceived autonomy, being able to work with colleagues, perceiving the social support of a supervisor and colleagues, which leads to a higher engagement, and can prevent burnout. I think in the military we have, and I'm a civil physician, so that means the lessons I learned there, I would like to picture here in the setting you're all working, performing. And I see a couple of key characteristics that maybe could lead to an increased risk of burnout. First of all is the hierarchy, which is also often applied, for example, in healthcare sector as well. If you look in organizations, we see that this kind of hierarchical culture leads to an increased risk of burnout. Also, the uncertainty about the future and maybe unexpected changes, even to move to another part of the country, is another important stressor which is related to army. So these are two examples which I think we should be aware of and try to take into account when making our assessment. So focus on the psychological outcome, characterize the job itself, and try to understand the biological mechanism. And for that, for concluding slide, I would like to launch a term also related to the omic terms we have introduced. This is the exposome. What we are trying to do in the exposome is actually to describe the exposure of an individual throughout his whole career, throughout his whole occupational career. And for that, we are making use of the different omic techniques I just introduced. So for that, and this is quite challenging, let's have a look, try to have a look at all kind of stressors, all kind of factors that characterize our job, and try to relate them to a health outcome for preventive purposes, for better mental health, and of course also to prevent the negative consequences such as, for example, burnout. Thanks a lot for your attention. See you next year in Brussels.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Lode Godderis. Thank you. We have seen how to focus more on the physical fitness. Now we have focused on the mental fitness. But now, ladies and gentlemen, for something completely different. Imagine the unthinkable happens. An explosion in a highly populated area or a terrorist attack in a crowded train station. Explosions aimed at the civilian population commonly result in mass casualty incidents, and the responding civilian hospitals rely on their medical staff, many of whom are inexperienced in trauma management in general and explosion injuries in particular. And the potential for clinical mistakes here is significant. So a number of questions arise. For example, how will triage be organized? What is the procedure for severely injured patients and for moderately injured patients? And are decisions made by the triage officers at the entrance of the emergency room really reliable? For this, we go live to Tel Aviv, to Dr. Itamar Ashkenazi. He's a general surgeon working at the Rambam healthcare campus in Haifa. He's a graduate of the Hebrew University Medical School in Jerusalem, and he completed a residency in general surgery at the Hillel Yaffe Medical Center, where he later served as deputy chairman of the department. And we're going to talk about patient management following terror explosions, the hospital perspective. And there we go, live in Tel Aviv. And I'm just going to do a little technical check. Dr. Ashkenazi, can you hear us?
Yes, I hear you very well. I hope you hear me as well.
I hear you loud and clear. Dr. Ashkenazi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is indeed an honor to be here with you at the Centennial organization. My name is Itamar Ashkenazi, and I'm a surgical oncologist. And throughout the years, I've been exposed to many mass casualty incidents, and I want to share with you this experience. This slide basically summarizes the main issues that I will be discussing. In Israel, most of the victims were not treated in level 1 trauma hospitals. They were actually treated in level 2. Attacks occurred in non-office hours, even after midnight. And sometimes the victims were distributed to many hospitals, but sometimes they were distributed to one hospital, which was overwhelmed. The problem is that the staff is not very familiar with the contingency plan. They've got other responsibilities. So we have to convey the plan in a way that they will understand very easily. And next, as you said, that when you have an explosion happening in a civilian setting, it not only results in a mass casualty incident with many patients, there are also many providers, medical providers, who are inexperienced, and you should be expecting mistakes. In the 90s, I was a resident in Shaarei Tzedek Medical Center, which is a level 2 trauma center. And we ended up receiving more victims from explosions than Hadassah, which is a level 1, because Hadassah is outside of the city. A committee was formed by Professor Omri Lernau, from whom I learned about the unidirectional flow plan. The unidirectional flow plan is the backbone of all Israeli hospitals' contingency plans. Basically, the mildly injured patients undergo some kind of work process, they're examined, eventually most of them are discharged, while the more serious patients are also worked up, some of whom are operated upon, and they end up being hospitalized in different departments. The unidirectional flow plan is very good in several senses. It really simplifies the planning, and each one of the boxes that you see is a unique site with a unique objective in a unique geographical place with assigned staff, assigned procedures and equipment, so everybody knows what to do when a mass casualty incident occurs. Furthermore, from our experience, the emergency department is quickly emptied out from victims once you implement the unidirectional flow plan. However, there are also problems with the unidirectional flow plan. It's labor intensive, and you have to place your most experienced people in those cross points where decisions are made. And that leaves you with very few people to take care of the seriously injured patients, and that is a problem. So you have to kind of compensate for these disadvantages. In the year 2000, I left Jerusalem and I went to live up north in Israel, and I started working in Hedera in a hospital which is a level 2 trauma center, pretty far away from other hospitals. And 4 months afterward, a bomb exploded in a bomb only 2 kilometers away from the hospital. So we admitted all the patients from that MCI. The head of surgery, Professor Ricardo Alfisi, had a different viewpoint on how to manage a mass casualty incident than the unidirectional flow plan. And to understand his view, I would like to basically go back a little bit, and you can appreciate here the amount of mass casualty incidents that we had during those years in that hospital. So going back, we need to understand the contingency main plan. What is the main objective? What are we trying to achieve? We already discussed the unidirectional flow plan that basically gives you an efficient, rapid workup of all victims. I would like to focus on the American College of Surgeons' main objective, which is basically to provide the greatest good for the greatest number of casualties. The problem with this statement is that if you realize that only 10% have life-threatening injuries, 10% have organ-threatening injuries, and 80% are mildly injured. So if you focus on the greatest number of casualties, you're basically focusing on the mildly injured victims. But then you can say that I got it all wrong, but it does focus on the seriously injured patients. But if you define an objective, shouldn't that objective clearly say that? So Ricardo Alfisi said, you know, we really want to not get people mixed up and get it wrong. Because if you look at the literature of what things that were published at that time, you'll notice the following examples, and exactly the same time that the statement came out. And this is from the East Presidential Talk, which was published in Journal of Trauma in 2002. And the author says there that unresponsive patients should be assumed to be dead and should not be resuscitated. Emergency room thoracotomy should be forbidden. Serious consideration must be given to avoiding blood transfusions and endotracheal tubes. So if you're not going to tube the patients, if you're not going to give them blood, then you have a difficulty with seriously injured patients. And this message was not only conveyed by this author, but by authors as well as colleagues from Israel. prioritizing the moderately injured rather than severely injured. And Ricardo Alfisi basically came out and said, this is not logical. Only 10% have life-threatening injuries. We should try to provide these patients with the right care at the right time, and if possible, by the people who are most experienced. So he came out with these 5 rules, which we both defined, and I'll briefly go over them. Rule number 1 says that to make an impact on survival, most, if not all, the initial resources should be allocated to the diagnosis and treatment of the severely injured victims. And yes, this comes at the expense of the rest. Rule number 2 says that those experienced in trauma management should be free of classical roles such as triage and incident manager, because they are the most important resource which can make an impact on survival. Why is this message important? This is from a study from Bellevue Hospital, a level 1 trauma center in Manhattan, which responded to 9/11, receiving more than 700 victims that day. They placed their most experienced person as triage officer. The second, third, and fourth most experienced were in charge of different areas in the emergency department and the hospital. And the one who got to operate those dying patients was a surgical oncologist. Well, I have nothing against surgical oncologists. I'm a surgical oncologist myself. But I want to suggest something. Maybe I should be doing triage, and maybe the trauma leaders, the ones who are experienced, they should be operating the patient, doing the damage control laparotomy to save that dying patient. And if you still don't accept what I'm saying, this is a picture from Bellevue Hospital, from the triage area. And you have to ask yourself, what is the impact of a triage officer on saving lives? The third rule says that identification of a severely wounded can only be done using continuous triage. We previously said that we shouldn't be putting our most experienced people in the hospital's door. So we should be expecting problems with the reliability of that triage. We actually examined this issue, and we looked at triage decisions made in 2 large mass casualty incidents, and we compared them to the real severity of injuries, and we were able to retrace this in over 90% of the patients. And as you can see, there were 15 severely injured victims, 7 were identified, but 8 were missed, and most of them were triaged as mild. So you could say that these Israeli guys have no idea how to do triage, that's okay. But then if you look at in between the lines in other publications, you see that this is a worldwide problem. And this is from Oklahoma City bombing, where 6 different hospitals employed a minor treatment area for mildly injured patients. And you can see the patients that were triaged over there. These include patients with hemorrhagic shock, head injury, fractures, vascular injuries. And why is this important? This is important because if you make a mistake at the doorstep and you divert the green patients to another place, then you will have a big problem. And why do triage problems happen? I want you to see these 3 videos and I will explain.
ערב בחדשות, תופת בצומת קרקור, לפחות 10 הרוגים, בפיצוץ מכונית עמוסה חומר נפץ בצמוד לאוטובוס.
ו50 פצועים פונו מזירת הפיגוע, מצבם של 6 קשה, בהם פעוטה ב2. הפגיעות הן מעורבות, בעלות אופי מעורב, פגיעות הדף.
עוד ועוד אמבולנסים הגיעו לבית החולים סורוקה, מביאים איתם עוד ועוד נפגעים מהמרכז המסחרי בדימונה.
הבוקר בשעה 4 דקות לפני 8 התפוצץ האוטובוס בקו 26 בירושלים. 5 נהרגו, 107 נפצעו, מהם 6 במצב קשה. מחצית הפצועים כבר שוחררו לבתיהם. זרועות הביטחון עדיין בודקים האם מדובר במחבל או במחבלת. כנראה שמדובר במחבל, וייתכן שפוצץ יותר ממטען אחד בחלקו האחורי של האוטובוס. החמאס הודיע שהוא אחראי לפיגוע.
So what we saw in these videos, we saw the triage officer with the red arrow pointing to his back. And we saw that there were many people in the triage area, many of them who maybe should not be there, taking pictures of the victims. We saw the ambulances were coming one after the other with 2, 3, 4 or more patients. So I really want to ask you, how can you expect the triage in these circumstances to be reliable? Can anyone really examine the patient or check the respiratory rate or the systolic blood pressure in this situation? Right or wrong, we decided on these parameters for doing triage at the hospital door. We only look if a patient is fully conscious or not, if a patient was exposed to significant blast energy or not. We don't measure blood pressure, we don't count respiratory rate, and we don't have a blue category for expectant at the door. And inside the emergency department, we divide the emergency department into areas for mildly, moderately, and severely injured patients. The patients are distributed according to what the triage officer had said in the door. This may be the situation after 20 minutes. And if you remember, first rule is that everyone, doesn't matter where he works, they should examine the patients and try to identify those who are severely injured. So if you do that, you basically identify those who have been under triaged and those who have been over triaged. And once you identify those who are really severely injured, and once you have enough staff, we open up a secondary site and we use the post-op recovery room. And we use that place because it's an enclosed environment, it has ICU-like capacities. It's next to the operating room if patients need to be operated upon. And in the Hillel Yaffe Medical Center, there was another advantage. It was next to the CT and angio suite. So we brought there all the red patients, regardless of the fact if they need surgery or not. And only after we had enough staff did we open in another place, the outpatient clinics, to admit those mildly injured victims, opening up more space for more patients if needed. Rule number 4 says that the customized plan should be supplemented with a liberal policy for hospitalization. I must say that I'm kind of against this rule because it is based on the fear that we're missing out on life-saving, life-endangering injuries in mildly injured patients. And when I looked at our data, not only of explosion victims, but also of shooting victims, basically, there were very few patients who were missed during this primary evaluation in the emergency department. And not only that, all of them had confounding, distracting, serious injuries. So we shouldn't be afraid of discharging somebody who looks like a mildly injured patient. I want to say a few things about FAST and CT scans. The current opinion of many of my colleagues is that FAST should be used liberally and should be used to screen patients, and CT scans should be restricted basically to evaluate for severe head injury. And I kind of ask myself if these recommendations are correct. If you look at this 16-year-old girl with a penetrating rectal injury, you can see that she's got many, many penetrating injuries. And it's very, very difficult to understand which one of these is a deep penetrating injury unless you do a CT scan. This is data from Norway for the twin terrorist attacks in Oslo and Toya Island. And as you can see, they had 8 patients who underwent laparotomy, and 4 of these were non-therapeutic. And the reason that these were non-therapeutic, as the authors write, they used ultrasound as a screening tool for abdominal bleeding. And they actually restricted CT scans to patients with suspected severe head injuries. And if we look at the same publication, you can see here in yellow how many patients underwent CT scan. And you can see that in the first 4 hours, only 4 patients underwent CT. Overall, in 11 hours, 11 patients underwent CT. So the CT was not overwhelmed. And this was also our experience in Israel. To be fair with my Norwegian colleagues, we had other places that reported on the false positive abdominal ultrasounds, which led to negative and non-therapeutic laparotomies. So what should be done? I think that EFAST, we shouldn't change the indication for EFAST from what we use it day to day. It should be used only in hemodynamically unstable patients which may be bleeding from the trunk. As much as CT is concerned, I suggest do not restrict total body CT if needed. I don't see any logic in restricting total body CT and being liberal with non-therapeutic laparotomies. Rule number 5 says that in a solitary mass casualty incident, the receiving hospital should simultaneously treat and triage victims for transfer. So if you're working in a hospital which admitted many patients and there are other hospitals nearby which did not, you should choose those moderately injured patients which were mildly injured and evacuate them to another hospital to be operated upon, because there's no reason why they should wait for many hours for an operation when they can be operated in another hospital 15, 30 minutes or 1 hour drive away. Looking at the patients who were operated, I want to say one thing. If you look at the patients who had life-threatening injuries, half of them were in need of an urgent operation. But then, even then, you could prioritize them to those who need an emergency operation right now, and those who could be delayed for half an hour, 1 hour, or more. So to conclude my presentation, we should define our objective in a way that will not be misinterpreted by our staff. It should be clear. We should be planning for non-office hours. We should not place our most experienced trauma leaders in triage and running the emergency incident. We should let them be intimately involved in the treatment of severely injured patients. We should understand that triage at the door will be inaccurate, and we should compensate doing continuous triage. We should make a clear decision who should undergo EFAST and who should not, who should undergo total body CT and who should not. We should learn to prioritize our patients to the operating room, and secondary triage patients who are stable and have moderately injured, moderate injuries to be transferred to other hospitals for treatment there, for surgical treatment there. So thank you very much. This was my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ashkenazi. You got a big round of applause here from the room. I hope that you heard it. You did. Thank you very much for your insights on patient management following terror explosions. And we hope to see you next year when you fly into Brussels for the ICMM World Congress from the 5th to the 9th of September. Will you be there?
It would be a pleasure.
It'd be a pleasure. There you go. Thank you very much, Dr. Ashkenazi, and hope to see you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the goals of the ICMM is to stay informed. Stay informed on new technologies, new innovations, and new approaches in medicine. And of course, you can't do that just sitting behind your desk. You have to go out there in the field. You have to go and explore and discover. That's exactly what happened a few weeks ago. Our Brigadier General Erwin Dont was invited by Isabelle François, Managing Director of Health House, to just come and have a look at what they exactly do. And just, well, we're going to have a look how that went.
Currently, we evolve to a more patient-centric healthcare, and we need to shift from a medicine that cures to a medicine that keeps us healthy. And that's why we are hosted by Mrs. Isabelle François, the Managing Director of Health House.
Welcome at Health House.
Thank you.
Health House is an experience platform in which we inform and connect people on the future of health and care. We immerse our visitors in unique digital content in which, for example, we show the newest technological innovations in healthcare. We approach health from a holistic point of view, leading to inspiring stories on well-being in general.
In my position as the Director General Health and Wellbeing of the Defense Forces, I am acting as the advisor to the Chief of Defense on preventive health and well-being, policy and matters, and on occupational health and safety in particular. In this way, I see it as my job, the job of the Chief Wellness Officer of the company actually, to shape and develop an integrated health and well-being policy for the whole Defense Forces, with a contemporary and a holistic vision on positive health, from both a mental and a physical angle, and as far as the application is concerned, based on our own structural integrated fitness model, and with attention to the principles of integrative medicine for a stronger link between health and well-being, and of course, counting on the individual's responsibility to take control over his or her health.
Let's go.
From the wonders of conception to the dream of longer and more fulfilling lives for everyone. I'll show you new ways to fight disease, new ways to ease pain and lessen discomfort, and new ways to make people's lives better from beginning to end. It is an exciting vision, and perhaps one that you too will shape. Come, let us proceed to the future of healthcare.
So welcome to the future. This is in essence the personalized approach which we showcase here at Health House. And this personalized approach is not only of importance for the general public, but is also of incredible value for military health and healthcare.
For sure, Isabel. If we want to better understand where we are going to in the future, maybe we should reflect a little bit on where recent worldwide conflicts have brought us in the meantime. Do you know, during the past 2 decades, a lot of achievements and progresses have been made in warrior care on the battlefield, leading to a genuine decrease of the case fatality rate, and that while the severity of injuries has ever continued to increase.
That seems so contradictory. How is that possible?
Well, there has been a long-term investment in military medical science and technology, and of course also in international collaboration. And this has contributed to those life-saving advances in military health and military health care. And that saved countless lives on the battlefield. Now, these advances mainly took place in combat casualty care, in particular for the treatment of hemorrhage on the battlefield.
Could you give some examples of these actions?
Tactical combat casualty care as a set of evidence-based pre-hospital trauma care guidelines, best practice guidelines as a matter of fact, reduced helicopter evacuation transport times, less than 60 minutes for the evacuation of critically injured victims, and rapid blood product transfusion as far forward as possible and more closer to the point of injury.
All the actions that you named, we know that they work today, but are we sure that they will work in the future?
Not at all. Today, the primary objective is to concentrate on future scientific endeavors, but from the perspective of future operations. So we assume that military medical support will have to be conducted in a different way, in a more innovative way, smarter with what we have got, and above all, focusing on more preventive and certainly more digitalized left-of-bang interventions.
When I think about left-of-bang, I think about artificial intelligence. I think about big data. Is there something else I need to think about?
Well, Isabel, just like in civil medicine, future defense health and healthcare will be profoundly influenced by precision medicine, by personalized medicine, by integrative medicine, by genetic engineering also, and also by a few other technologies, other treatments, other evolutions, just as nano, stem cell treatment or regenerative medicine.
You know, currently there are already technologies that, based on artificial intelligence, can give predictive outcomes. Let me show you.
The future of healthcare.
Here we are now. This is the MindStretch app, one of these examples of the technologies I was talking about. It's a clinically validated app that can make the distinction between the use of physical and mental energy, and this based on measurements of heart rate, but also the accelerometer. It can also show you the use of mental energy and the recovery levels of mental energies. If your mental energy recovery levels are low, then you have a visualization in orange. If they're high, you have a green visualization. As such, you could make a selection of those tactical athletes that are most optimal or most fit to go into the battlefield, for instance. And in addition, this app also enables prediction of an infection even before symptoms occur.
That's interesting, because with biomarkers and with nanotechnologies, we create wearables and implantables or even ingestibles that can measure vitals and also health and performance determinants, and as such monitor the digital soldier. And additionally, by the growing understanding of genetics, psychiatrists and our psychologists will soon be able to screen the soldiers and to determine whether they will be more likely to cope with the stresses of a dangerous mission, or whether they will be better off behind the desk instead of patrolling in the field.
This having said, just as warfare, shouldn't recovery from war not be optimized as well?
Exactly. We must be aware that these novel medical support paradigms in future warfighting also apply during recovery from war.
Let's envisage how that might look.
And here it's key to develop and to validate workable solutions to the short-term and the long-term challenges for the resilience, the recovery, the rehabilitation, and also the reintegration of those visible and invisible wounded, ill, and injured. So imagine, Isabel, how advanced prosthetics, 3D printed biomaterials and drugs, artificial organs, and much more stuff will complete, after all, our medical response assets and treatment capabilities.
Absolutely. Currently, exoskeletons are physically supporting paralyzed soldiers in their so much needed rehabilitation process. To Walk Again is an organization that really focuses on this rehabilitation process with these exoskeletons. Another example is the fact that 3D printed casts can be used now and that can replace these very heavyweight conservative casts. 3D printed casts are much more lightweight and will help soldiers in their rehabilitation process.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for the tour and the talk. And you will be able to experience these and many more other novel technologies during the 44th World Congress of Military Medicine next year in Brussels. We are really looking forward to meeting you there. We will make this Congress happen together.
The least we can say, ladies and gentlemen, is that it was a very inspiring visit at Health House, and I think that Brigadier General Erwin Dont was really pleased with the invitation. And also, in the audience is Isabelle François, Managing Director of Health House. Where exactly? Give her a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for having us, and it was truly inspiring. Also, the people from the 3D printed casts are here, so if you want more information, you can visit them after the presentations. It's high time now for the fourth speaker of today, ladies and gentlemen, and I want you to imagine something. Imagine that you're on vacation. You're on vacation in Egypt. It's an amazing country, so beautiful. And you've seen the great pyramids of Giza, and the Karnak temple, and the Valley of the Kings, and you have visited the temple of Abu Simbel, and it's going so wonderful. And all of a sudden, something happens. Your partner gets ill, and if I say ill, I'm not talking about a common cold, but I'm saying really ill, seriously ill. Acinetobacter baumannii. I'm going to say that again, because I studied. Acinetobacter baumannii is what we call MDR, or a multi-drug resistant bacteria. It's what we call a superbug. And that's what happened. How this story ends, well, let's find out, ladies and gentlemen. Just been promoted to distinguished professor. Distinguished Professor Steffanie Strathdee is the Associate Dean of Global Health Sciences, Harold Simon Professor at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine, and co-director at the Center for Innovative Phage Applications and Therapeutics. She will talk to us about the battle against infections and phage therapy. Please give a big round of applause for distinguished Professor Steffanie Strathdee.
Thank you, everyone. It's just such a pleasure to be here. Now, this world has been grappling with this viral pandemic, COVID-19, for the last 2 years. But what if I was to tell you that a virus, a very special kind of virus, is actually one of the most powerful weapons that we have against the next pandemic, antimicrobial resistance? Well, first, I have a couple of disclosures to make. But also, I want to put this perspective of past, present, and future of phage therapy into a personal lens. As you heard, my husband acquired a superbug infection while we were traveling in Egypt. Turns out he'd had a gallstone that lodged in his common bile duct, and it caused a giant abscess the size of a small football to form. And he got very ill. The Egyptian physicians did the best they could, but he was medevaced first to Frankfurt's Uniclinic, where they diagnosed what they considered to be one of the worst bacteria on the planet, Acinetobacter baumannii. Now, this organism is no stranger to military medicine. In fact, many veterans had been medevaced out of the Gulf War and Afghanistan with this organism, and it has closed down ICUs and hospitals across Western Europe and even the United States. But that wasn't all. This organism is known to have multi-drug resistance, and when the doctors in Frankfurt ran an antibiogram to see what antibiotics could be susceptible to, they found that it was already resistant to 15. Now, I didn't understand German very well, but I knew that every R on this antibiogram meant resistant, and it was only partially sensitive to 3 right off the bat. And one of those is colistin, the last resort antibiotic that was developed in World War II. Unfortunately, by the time Tom got medevaced back to San Diego, where my colleagues at the University of California, San Diego were caring for him, it was resistant to even those last 3 antibiotics. And they told me something I never wanted to hear, that Tom was going to die. Well, at this moment, I thought, he squeezed my hand when I asked him if he wanted to live. And I thought, well, I'm not a medical doctor, but I am a scientist, and I do know how to do research. So I did what anybody would do. I went home, and I hit the internet. And I found this paper that was published by Spanish researchers when I was looking for alternative treatments to antibiotic-resistant, multi-drug-resistant Acinetobacter baumannii. And in it, buried in this paper, was something called phage therapy. And I knew that bacteriophage, or phage for short, are viruses that have naturally evolved to attack bacteria. But I didn't ever know that they were used to treat bacterial infections in humans. In fact, just like the ICMM, phage therapy has had a 100-year-old history. In fact, as early as 1896, a British researcher, Hankin, followed by a Russian researcher, Nikolai Gamaleya, and a Polish researcher, Bonislaw Fagin, saw this bacteriolytic activity in their Petri dishes. They didn't know quite what they were seeing. It wasn't until Frederick Twort in 1915, he saw the same kind of thing and published on it and surmised, is this an enzyme? Is it some kind of other organism? But it was Félix de Harel, a self-taught French-Canadian microbiologist in 1917, who took fecal matter from children who had survived bacterial dysentery, put it through a Pasteur filter, and found that that filtrate was still able to kill bacteria in suspension. And he watched this turbid water turn clear, and he said, this is smaller than bacteria. It must be a parasite of bacteria because it can kill the bacteria. So therefore, it must be a virus. And he called this bacteriophage, derived from the Greek meaning bacteria eater. Well, there were some skeptics because light microscopes couldn't see these phages. Turned out they were 100 times smaller than bacteria. But Félix was not to be vindicated. He went on to use phage therapy to treat children who were dying of dysentery, first in 1919, and then went on to treat other people and animals. And phage therapy had something of a heyday in the 1920s and 30s. In fact, he and Georgi Eliava set up what was the first phage therapy center in what is now Tbilisi, Georgia. And this was followed by a phage therapy clinic in Wrocław, Poland. And phages were used on the battlefields in the wars that the Russians fought against the Finns and the Chechens. They were also found in Rommel's forces in Germany in World War II. And this, unfortunately, cast a pall over the whole field of phage therapy because it got the reputation of being Soviet science. And of course, penicillin came on the scene in 1942, and this was almost the death knell for phage therapy because the West forgot all about it. They embraced penicillin because it was a wonder drug and Big Pharma was born. But in the East, parts of Poland and the former Soviet Union, they still used phage therapy. It was over the counter even, and it's still used to this day. Ironically, in the early 1940s, the electron microscope was developed by German researchers. And it was then that Felix de Herel was truly vindicated because you could see phage for the very first time. This is an electron micrograph, a scanning electron micrograph. And stained in orange is a bacterium. Stained in green are what looks like tiny alien spiders. And these are a certain type of phage. They're attaching to the bacterial cell through a receptor. They drill into it, and their genetic material, usually DNA, enters the bacterial cell, turns it into a phage manufacturing plant. And when given the kill signal, these baby virions burst out, and they go on to attack other bacteria. But here's the thing. They only attack the bacteria that they are a match to. They don't harm any of the friendly bacteria in our microbiome, unlike antibiotics that kind of have a scorched earth approach that can kill not just the pathogenic bacteria, but the friendly bacteria too. So there's all kinds of phages that we know about now, all shapes and sizes, but there's about 10 million trillion phages estimated to be on the planet. That's 10 to the power of 31. So I started to think, well, you know, phage is still experimental in North America now, but maybe, just maybe, we could get phage therapy to cure Tom. Well, I took this photo of Tom lying in bed in a coma, and draped upon him is a T-shirt that one of our students gave us, and it says, "I survived Iraqibacter," which was the nickname for Acinetobacter baumannii. And I wrote total strangers that I had researched and found on the internet, and one of them was Dr. Ryland Young from Texas A&M University. And he was sympathetic, and he said, look, if you send me his bacterial isolate, I'll turn my lab into a command center, and I'll have to look in some pretty crazy places to try to find phages that will match your husband's isolate. Do you know what I'm talking about? And I did. I said, sewage, right? And he said, yes, because wherever you find a lot of bacteria, like sewage, barnyard waste, duck ponds, you're going to find the perfect predator that preys upon them. So his lab went to work. But he said, you know, it would be much better if we found phages that had already been characterized and sequenced rather than having to go to environmental sources. So with your permission, I'm going to reach out to my network of phage researchers around the world. And first, you know, we had offers of help from phage researchers in Switzerland and India. But one of the most important connections that he made was to Dr. Jean-Paul Pernet, who's here today, from the Queen Astrid Military Hospital in Belgium. And Jean-Paul said, we have active phage against Acinetobacter. He said, I can see if we can send them to you in a diplomatic pouch. Well, even though these phages weren't active against my husband's isolate, this single act of charity was one of the reasons that the U.S. Navy Medical Research Unit decided to help my husband, who was a civilian. This is Lieutenant Commander Theron Hamilton, who looks a little bit like Tom Cruise. He and his colleague, Dr. Biswajit Biswas, looked at their Acinetobacter baumannii library. They had about 100 phages at the time that had been sourced from the bilges of ships around the world. And they found 4 phages that matched. And turns out so did Young's lab. Well, now we had another problem because we had phages that could be used to kill Tom's isolate, but how are we going to give it to him? So that was the next dilemma, and it turned out that yet another researcher from the Royal Astrid Military Hospital, Dr. Maya Mirabishvili, who's been trained at the Georgia Iliava Center, she was an expert on this, and she said, well, the dose is something to be considered because the drug is alive. The bacteria are going to be attacked as long as they are there, and so the drug is multiplying within the body. So we considered the routes of administration, how often, how long. Nobody knew the answers, but her insight was very important. Also, Dr. Carl Merrill, who was a researcher on phage at the NIH for many years, was consulted, and he said, you know, your husband really needs to be treated intravenously, because if there's a hidden reservoir of bacteria that the phage don't reach, it could become resistant to the phage very quickly. So at this point, when we decided that we were going to do both, we would put the phages in the catheters in his abdomen, but then we would go intravenous if he survived that. And that was the scary part, because there was no protocol on this, and none of the phages from the Navy or from the Texas A&M group had ever been used in a human being. Well, between the first email that I sent for help and when we had phages to treat Tom was only 3 weeks. About half that time was spent trying to purify the phage of endotoxin when nobody knew exactly what the threshold for safety would be. And here's the team that treated Tom: Dr. Chip Schooley and colleagues, Dr. Pissell, who put, as an interventional radiologist, placed the phages in the catheters in his abdomen. And it was the scariest day of my life, for sure. But believe it or not, 3 days later, even though he was in multi-stage organ failure, and I had signed the consent form for kidney dialysis the day we started phage therapy, Tom woke up 3 days later, lifted his head off the pillow, and kissed his daughter's hand. Everyone in the ICU was shocked. Now, Tom had a long recovery. He got out of the hospital 9 months later, but everybody believes that if he'd gotten phage therapy earlier in the course of his illness, he could have walked out of the hospital. A case report was published, and we also showed that there was synergy between antibiotics and the phages, and this has been seen in other cases as well. And that's another line of inquiry for the future. Now, a 100-year anniversary of the discovery of bacteriophages was a celebration at the Pasteur Institute. And one of the researchers who sourced phages for Tom presented his case, and it was very well received. In fact, the story went viral, but in a good way. We had press from all over the world, but also researchers who had not decided to publish his case in some of the top journals came and decided to have Q&As or commentaries after the fact because it was considered to be an important case. It seemed to reinvigorate phage therapy in the West. In fact, we went on to treat other patients, as did others in Western Europe, to treat patients intravenously with phage because now it was seen as safe. And we had considerable success so that our chancellor gave us seed money to launch what became the first dedicated phage therapy center in North America, IPATH. And when it was opened 3 years ago, Science magazine published a commentary saying this is a game changer in the field. Well, since then, researchers at our institute and all over the world have published case reports and case series on different routes of administration and different applications of phage for all sorts of different kinds of superbugs. One of these miraculous cases was that of John, who had a Klebsiella pneumonia infection following a prosthetic joint replacement. And he'd had 19 surgeries on his leg, and none of them took. In fact, the picture in the middle shows the red blotches on his leg that were spreading up. And he was told he was going to have his leg amputated. His wife heard about my husband's case, approached a local phage company. They sourced phage for him, and after only 2 infusions, look at the picture on the right. It was miraculous. The Mayo Clinic published this case with colleagues, and now they've opened their first phage therapy center. So has Baylor University and Yale University. Other phage programs are flourishing across Western Europe. Now, this phage therapy approach isn't without challenges. We've had over 1,100 people who've come to us at our center asking for phage therapy, but not all of them are eligible because the FDA considers this to be emergency treatment that is salvage only after antibiotics have fully failed. But even when phage therapy has been indicated, we sometimes can't find phage fast enough to save the patient's life. In fact, we've only treated about 2.5% of all of the patients that have approached us. So what does this really mean? Well, in our view, we really need to build a phage library. Now imagine a giant walk-in cooler, if you will, with phage that has been identified, sequenced, characterized. You know which receptor it hits. You know which other phages they go along with. Some of these phage will be natural phage that are sourced from the environment. Some of them may need to be genetically modified phage or even synthetic phage that could be used with something of a 3D printer approach, because sometimes it's difficult to optimize the phage lifestyle to kill the bacteria that we want. And in fact, the first genetically modified phage cocktail to be successfully used in a human being was a case that was published just 2 years ago in May of 2019. This is Isabel. She has cystic fibrosis, and her congenital condition means that mucus builds up in her lungs and she's prone to bacterial infections. She'd had a double lung transplant, and now her new lungs were being attacked by Mycobacterium abscessus, a cousin to tuberculosis, a very difficult intracellular bacterial pathogen. Now, her mother, again, heard about Tom's case, approached her doctor. Doctors reached out across the pond, and lo and behold, a program that involves students to crowdsource phage from different environmental sources had a whole library of Mycobacterium phages. And Dr. Graham Hatfill from the University of Pittsburgh, his students sourced these phages. He found several phages that were a match for Isabel's bacterial isolate, but only one was the lytic kind that will kill it directly. The other two were kind of sleepy phages that don't kill the host bacterial cell right away. So what he did was he clipped out the repressor gene, he and his lab mates, and forced those phage to be the lytic virulent kind. And in doing so, this was the first genetically modified phage cocktail. Well, did it work? Well, Isabel was in hospice when she received her phage, and it was treated intravenously, like in Tom's case. She left the hospital within a week. She's still alive to this day. She isn't without her challenges, but this case has really brought biotech and pharma to the fore, and it's also given hope that maybe we can treat Mycobacterium tuberculosis with phage someday. So looking ahead, we've got a path. We have lots of different views on the table, but if we treat phage like living antibiotics and use rigorous approaches to put it through clinical trials, then we can license it alongside antibiotics. We don't think it will ever replace antibiotics, but it will be another powerful weapon in our arsenal. And Dr. Pirnet has published a commentary about phage therapy in the year 2035, what that will look like, along with a study protocol called Phage Force. New clinical trials have been launched, some of which have been sponsored by the National Institute of Health for the first time. And finally, my husband's case doesn't just show that we have to reinvigorate phage therapy. It also shows the power of international collaboration in the face of a global health threat. And military medicine holds so much promise to be able to deal with this, because by the year 2050, one person every 3 seconds is going to be dying from a superbug infection. So I'll leave you with the faces of so many people that saved my husband's life, and I have to tell you, it's very emotional for me to be here. Because if we can do this for one man, we can do it for the planet. Miracles don't just happen, miracles are made. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, distinguished Professor Steffanie Strathdee, and what an amazing story. And every time, ladies and gentlemen, I've heard it a few times now in the rehearsal, and every time I'm so touched by what happened there with Tom and how they cope with this problem and how they found a solution. Truly, truly amazing. We go back 100 years, ladies and gentlemen. We go back to 1921, when two people sat together after the atrocities and the big disaster of World War I. Captain William S. Bainbridge and Major General Jules Vonken. And they sat together and they decided, we have to do something. We have to come together. We have to work together. Who would have thought that these two gentlemen founded something that still exists today, and that is so powerful, and that reaches out around the globe to gather experience and knowledge and expertise from these different domains? I think they would have been proud to see us here. I think they would have been really proud of about everything that has been achieved in the past 100 years. Because look where we are today, a global collaboration where the exchange of experiences and knowledge has led to numerous innovations that are implemented during peacetime, but also during battle and post-battle. And here to give you an overview of everything that can be possible, thanks to ICMM. He serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Readiness Policy and Oversight. He directs department-wide efforts to develop and implement policies and programs relating to Department of Defense deployment medicine, force health protection, national disaster support, medical research and development, global health management, human and animal research regulatory oversight, and medical readiness for 2.3 million service members. How global health initiatives help militaries and nations. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. David Smith.
Well, good afternoon to everyone in the room, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those around the world virtually. We just heard from an accomplished panel of presenters that I'm grateful to follow, and I appreciate the opportunity to represent beside our partners in this forum. And I take great interest in the information being presented today and learned a lot and hope you have too. Today, I'm going to share what makes the idea of global health engagement happen in real life. As military medics, innovation often springs from our cooperation, whether on the battlefields or in response to disasters. And sharing experiences and knowledge helps us to build capacity for innovating and delivering great health outcomes. Think about hemorrhage control. 100 years ago, we knew we needed to stop major bleeding events, but we had limited tools and knowledge. And I can remember when tourniquet was considered and thought to be the tool of last resort. If you use it, you will most likely lose that limb. But we have learned and relearned over the course of the last 20 years that the appropriate use of tourniquets saves lives and does not further endanger the limb when properly used. And the combat action tourniquet, or the CAT tourniquet, has likely saved more lives on the battlefield than any other medical intervention that we have. And through experience, we can now rapidly stop bleeding with these modern tourniquet devices born out of our collective experience. So in the next several minutes, I'll share other examples of activities, programs, and initiatives of military medical cooperation and innovation across nations, or some of what in the United States we call global health engagement. And my first example, let me start with the International Committee on Military Medicine, or ICMM, our host. They have been an important way that we've come together to cooperate, increase capacity, and innovate in military medicine. A chain of sharing, learning, innovating, and finding solutions to the tough challenges, as has been described, as the fabric of what created the ICMM in 1921. And after World War I, we really found ourselves needing a peace-driven outlet to communicate medical knowledge between the various armed forces medical services of the world, and 100 years later, we are celebrating that intergovernmental support that followed. And ICMM's missions and values still resonate today. We are sharing critical knowledge and lessons learned from the battlefield, addressing disaster medicine and refugee assistance, and combating looming infectious diseases, and recently weathering a pandemic together. And my premise today is that the efforts to work to prevent, detect, respond, and collaborate in the medical and health areas leads to greater military and civilian health capabilities for all involved. Now, over the last 100 years, military medical services around the world have increased medical interoperability, and by that I mean we are better able to work together exchange health information, and use it once received. We've built greater capabilities, strengthened partnerships, and fostered more global health security. And we all can sense and have seen that security threats from health catastrophes are real. And the spillover effects due to breakdowns in health systems, from whatever the cause, can be harder to contain than armed conflicts themselves. Even as militaries around the globe exist to protect their nation's sovereignty, people don't immediately think about medicine or health factoring into their nation's defense. But we all know better, and we all know the critical importance of what we do to national global security. Now, as noted earlier, nearly half of the combat forces report witnessing one of their team members go into an acute stress reaction. And this is where an individual is so overwhelmed by stress that their thinking and their body function is impaired. In the military, acute stress reactions can endanger the individual, their team, and the mission. And until recently, there was no approach to prepare teams in the heat of combat for managing acute stress when time clearly matters. But based on the experiences of the Israeli Defense Forces, the American military has adopted an acute stress training so our service members can manage stress with a teammate when it matters most. And this peer-based intervention is called iCover, and there are basically 5 steps. First, identify the signs of acute stress. 2, connect through eye contact, voice, and touch. 3, reassure the individual that they're not alone. 4, establish order of events by quickly orienting the person to what is happening. And 5, request action by providing simple direction. Now, the American military has tested iCover with our soldiers and Marines of the 2nd Security Forces Assistance Brigade, and over 95% reported the training was very useful. And we've since woven it into other training offerings across our military. And there are at least 6 other partner nations that are looking at how to address stress on the battlefield since receiving this innovative training. Now, another example of collaboration and innovation is the development of safe and equitable access to far-forward surgical care around the world. Sri Lanka stands out to me in this area, and that's due to the relationship that they started with retired U.S. Army Colonel, vascular surgeon, and professor Norman Rich. Now, Dr. Rich's work with Combat Vascular Trauma Registry inspired a Sri Lankan military surgeon to reach out to improve combat casualty care. And you see, both Dr. Rich and the surgeon carefully recorded every single vascular injury and repair during separate combat wars. Following the Sri Lankan Civil War, the surgeon wanted to compare findings with Dr. Rich and discuss what he had learned from his efforts creating a vascular registry during the Vietnam War. And Sri Lanka's email to Dr. Rich created a connection with the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda, Maryland, that continues to benefit both the United States and Sri Lanka today. And the first face-to-face meeting between the USU faculty and the Sri Lankan colleagues took place in 2018 when the USNS Mercy hospital ship arrived in a Sri Lankan port. And they brought both military and civilian trauma surgeons together on a tour of the ship and created a vision for ways to improve access to surgical care in Sri Lanka. Now, to address the post-conflict loss of combat surgical readiness that many of our militaries experience, Sri Lanka created the Sri Lankan College of Military Medicine, where international experts in combat casualty care share their experience, and Sri Lanka has lectured at USU's Department in Surgery and Radiology also. And as a result of this relationship, there have been 21 collaborative peer-reviewed publications to date, And the College of Surgeons in Sri Lanka have established a trauma committee with strong military representation. And although delayed by COVID-19, the USU faculty are working on the first military surgical track course in Sri Lanka called the Advanced Surgical Skills for Exposure and Trauma, or the ASSET course. And thanks to the collaborative engagement, future plans include increasing student and resident bilateral exchanges with the Sri Lankan Military Medical School and USU to help sustain surgical capabilities in combat experiences for generations of military surgeons in both countries. And now to shift gears a bit. While global health engagement efforts help increase trauma system capabilities and capacity to respond quickly, there are trauma-related realities that require continuous medical interventions. And let's consider injury management and rehabilitation. Recent advances in prosthetics have been amazing and serve as shining lights to many within the military community. Within a military context, injuries are inevitable, and the toll on the human body comes with a particularly physically demanding, hazardous occupation. Now, modern technology and resources have increased the use of active rehabilitation techniques, starting at the time of injury and encouraging rehab within or as close to the unit as possible. Now, also, as a result of improved body armor, we all know that more service members are surviving previously lethal injuries, but they sometimes live with injuries such as amputation, spinal cord injury, and traumatic brain injury. So the US has worked with Estonia, Georgia, Ukraine, and other partners to share lessons we've learned to improve the rehabilitation and reintegration of injured service members. And for example, an alliance of Estonian soldiers who had fought alongside American forces in combat has now evolved into a partnership for care with wounded warriors. And the Estonians have been able to renovate their amputee rehabilitation center in East Tallinn Central Hospital with a modern equipment because of a joint initiative involving civilian and military contributors. Now, Estonia has an annual incidence of about 400 amputee patients, and the hospital serves both military and civilian amputee patients. And currently, given the significant improvement in rehabilitation medicine, Estonia is now a regional leader. And that they actually hosted the International Military Rehabilitation Symposium in 2019, an event that brought together 7 countries to Tallinn to discuss rehabilitation best practices. Now, along the same thread of rehabilitation, Ukraine faced significant casualties during military operations in 2014, with a variety of war injuries. So beginning with the site visits to Walter Reed and San Antonio military medical centers in 2016, Ukrainian rehabilitation leaders gained valuable insights into the full spectrum of modern rehabilitation medicine. And these leaders were better able to define goals for rehabilitative capabilities. And the American experts provided hands-on training to assist in achieving these goals. And I will tell you, Ukraine has had impressive results with their patient outcomes, noting that 20% of their amputee patients currently return to active duty. And prior to 2014, 0 amputee patients returned to active duty. And these efforts have also, in part, resulted in the changing of Ukrainian law. New laws modernized standards to create a common language of disability and rehabilitation, which has led to formalized training and continued education requirements for Ukrainian rehabilitation providers. Now, as a final example, I want to talk about how global health engagement clearly matters to security cooperation and the protection of the health of our force and communities. To reduce infectious threats requires capacity to detect, diagnose, and respond to the presence of dangerous pathogens. And when we conduct global biosurveillance in close coordination with each nation, we have the greatest chance of identifying the pathogenic threats at the source as they emerge. And then we're able to respond to the discovery, hopefully early, ideally preventing the spread and hopefully containing the outbreak. Now, since World War II, the American Department of Defense has built a network of partner laboratories across 4 continents with a collective mission of building partner collaboration, identifying infectious disease threats to forces, and mitigating those threats. Our Global Health Emerging Infectious Surveillance and Response Program, we say GEIS for short, leverages the presence of these laboratories, and they collaborate with many other partner nations around the world in our efforts to identify disease threats and respond to disease outbreaks early. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, we've been able to leverage these laboratories, 3 of which are conducting whole genome sequencing for variants, along with a robust network of about 400 participating respiratory disease surveillance sites in over 30 countries. And the labs provide timely and actionable information to preventive medicine personnel and senior leaders. And sharing epidemiologic information with our partners, diagnostic test results, and providing the training required to perform COVID-19 testing helps yield increased collaboration and capacity. So as I hope it's obvious, this work supports our mutual mission to protect the health of our forces and our communities. Other outcomes resulting from long-term international partnerships include life-saving therapies like phage therapy and vaccines for diseases such as HIV, Japanese encephalitis, hepatitis, and Ebola. And our researchers collaborate with military and civilian partner nation colleagues in places typically where outbreaks can spread widely and rapidly. An example, in the midst of the terrible Ebola outbreak in 2015, we joined forces with West African partner nations and civilian colleagues to create the Joint West Africa Research Group. And improving clinical and research capabilities is critical to current and emergent pathogens. And while research is sometimes focused on a specific disease, it can be leveraged to address others, as occurred during Ebola. In addition, for over 20 years, the American Department of Defense HIV/AIDS Prevention Program, or DHAP, has worked side by side with over 80 partner militaries to mitigate the impact of HIV, saving lives and contributing to building local health system capability. And these numbers have decreased over time as the epidemic has been better controlled. But international investments for studying infectious diseases and the legacy of HIV/AIDS relief execution has helped create a more resilient health system for partner countries and confront current health challenges like COVID-19. But there is clearly more we all need to do. But when collaboration occurs, our militaries and nations can better handle natural, man-made disasters and bring them under control effectively to manage resources, and most importantly, to save lives and manage the disaster. So, as we reflect on all that has been made possible through ICMM over the last 100 years, let us look ahead to where innovation and collaboration in global health engagement can go next. And finally, the U.S. has had the privilege to serve as the vice chair of ICMM, and in that role, I would like, on behalf of all the participants today, to offer special thanks to our host, Belgium, General Don't, and his team for all of their efforts to put the Centennial Talks together, and look forward to continuing our conversations and future collaborations again in 2022 for the 44th ICMM World Congress. Thank you.
Gentlemen, absolutely looking forward to meeting you in Brussels from the 5th until the 9th of September. Registrations are open, so once you leave this room, then just go on your smartphone and then register for next year. In the meantime, I have my distinguished speakers here. I have Lieutenant Colonel Professor Dr. Wes Zimmermann, Professor Dr. Lode Godderis. I have Brigadier General Erwin Dont, I have distinguished Professor Steffanie Strathdee, and I have Dr. David Smith for a short panel discussion. Will not take too much of your time. Let's say 15 minutes. Is that okay for everyone? Yes, more than enough. Yes, there we go. We were talking a lot about the past. We were talking about 1921, evolution to 2021. I think, like you said, can I say David?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. David, like you said in your final speech, that we have to look forward. So, what I want to know is the ICMM. What do you see as an evolution towards the future? So, what is the role of ICMM like for the coming, let's say, not 100 years, but 50 years? Because the world is changing in such a rapid pace. So, how do you see this? Who wants to go first?
Well, I think that we have heard a lot of examples of so-called pandemics, new pandemics, various pandemics. We have heard examples of the reintegration after prolonged sick leave, for instance. We have heard examples of bacterial multi-drug resistance, examples of mental illnesses with burnout on the forefront, but also suicide is one of those. Preventable death due to trauma, also civilian trauma. I think that those problems should be considered as global problems as well, and global problems, they ask for global solutions.
Yeah.
And that's why those solutions can be given by transcending borders, collaboration that transcends borders. And I think that these examples might further encourage organizations like ICMM in effectively and efficiently responding to the request that was highlighted by General Lehre in his speech. So I think that's the way I see the future of those international, intergovernmental and neutral, impartial organizations as ICMM.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Everybody agree? Yes, go ahead, Lode.
No, I also think the collaboration is very important because we've learned from your talk, which was very impressive, by the way, that actually by bringing all kind of experiences together and expertise together of all over the globe makes that we can save lives. And that's actually quite important. And I think we will also need it if we want to apply omic analysis. We will obtain a lot of data about individuals, but in order to interpret and analyze this data, we will need a lot of capacity as well, and a lot of data of individuals. And I think there might be a challenge because of, okay, how can we combine the respect for the individual, the privacy of the individual, together with the potential advantages there are for our society in better understanding the development of disease. And I think that's something that would be very interesting to hear about what the ICMM thinks within the military. Yeah.
What really strikes me is if we go a little bit back to the past, then if we talk about the preparation of the people who are in the military, it has changed so drastically. What I have seen, as we were discussing in the backstage, we were discussing like in World War I, then you got your rifle and your helmet and your uniform, and then they told you, go. There's the battlefield, and you have to go and fight. And in the Second World War, you had like a training, a basic training, and now it goes further and further up to a point where it gets really, really high tech. How do you see this in the future? Can I call you Wes?
Sure.
Okay. How do you see?
My wife does.
Okay. So how do you see this preparation of the forces?
Well, it was part of my talk where I think in the future, if we have specialized forces, if we have less casualties, it means that we can invest time and effort into educating and training these special forces, and we will take more time, and they must have more time to be able to handle the load and to be able to operate the robotic environment where they fight like we see in the movies.
Okay. Do you think that's a future, that where they have this exoskeleton that can assist them? And
absolutely, it's happening. It will happen.
It is happening, right?
It is happening. There is much research into robotic support of the body of the soldier.
All right.
So it is the future.
Go ahead.
And I would like to add and build on that, that also the missions are going to continually evolve and change. And so I think we need to maintain our agility to be able to, and the training has to allow us to flex, because hopefully it won't be battlefield work as much as it is dealing with disasters and helping in civil defense and other areas. So we need to be prepared to be able to do the full spectrum, which continues to widen every day. So even 2 years ago, who would have imagined that we would be wearing masks and dealing with the pandemic?
Yeah, and also what I think is that the more modern warfare will not be in the numbers of people, but in the expertise of the different forces. And also what I would like to know, Steffanie, what is your view? Because you're on a biological level. Can we prepare forces before they go into battle? Like you were talking about bacteriophage. Is it possible to make them like biologically already resistant before they go into a conflict?
Well, I think taking a broader view, I was struck by the presentations in terms of thinking more holistically, that we need to step away from crisis management and to think about preparedness, pandemic preparedness on the one hand, preparing for the next crisis, which is already here, really, antimicrobial resistance, but also with respect to mental health. I mean, really, it's stigmatized, PTSD, suicidality, and it's I think very healthy to be able to say we're all struggling with mental health problems as a result of COVID, whether you're a civilian or whether you're, in the armed forces. And what can we do to become more resilient? What can we do to help our troops prepare for the inevitabilities of facing, extreme stress? But in terms of phage, I think really being able to build a phage library is important, but it has to map on to a superbug library. So that really takes us back from an epidemiologist's point of view to surveillance, and to be able to use that wonderful map that David showed of all of the different locations around the world. Those are sources for superbugs, and where you find a lot of superbugs, you find a lot of phage. So the two go hand in hand.
All right. So what you're saying is, well, we have to really be prepared, not only on a civil level, but also on a military level. If we talk about mental health, what I wonder is, in the future, will you be able to mentally prepare forces for what they are going to do? Is it because shell shock, that was because you were thrown into a situation, you had to cope with it, and there you go. And the effect, that was for after the war. Is it possible to mentally train military forces?
Yes, I think David illustrated that, right? So the effect seems to be, the impact of training seems to be very positive. So I think, yes, you can train people to cope with stress. That's certainly possible. Will that prevent all mental health disorders? I think for that we need more research and understanding. But there will always be a relation between the stressor and our individual characteristics. And I think the challenge is then for us as medics to see how we can influence this interaction in a positive way.
Yeah. The threats have changed totally. We went to the boots on the ground, like we said. Now we go to pandemics. What do you see as other threats towards the future? If we step away from the biological factor, what are other threats that you see?
Well, probably that future military engagement is a threat on itself. It will be totally different as the battle that we are fighting today. There will be increased adversary capability. There will be contested communications. There will be artificial intelligence influencing us. More lethal weapons as well. And so that will limit, to a certain extent, our access to casualties and to casualty evacuation systems. And on itself, that will lead to an overload of our evacuation systems as well, because we'll have to deal with much more victims. And that's a little bit the other extreme of the continuum as a complement on what Wes was saying. And when confronted with overloaded evacuation systems and medical treatment facilities, we should have the courage to rethink our triage systems. And so I concur a little bit what our colleague Ashkenazi was saying during his speech. I think there is a lot of work to do with the view on the future military engagement, and that's a threat on itself, because if we don't make those reflections will not be prepared.
Yeah. Go ahead, David.
And I would just build on that prolonged field care is something that we clearly need to learn much more about because of all of the issues that General Don't just mentioned, and needs to be a key area of further investigation from my perspective.
We were talking about military medicine. Is there like the close collaboration between the military medicine and the civil medicine? Is that something that you see that will grow towards the future? Because right now I have the impression, but I'm a layman, that there is a big distinction between both those worlds. That you have the civil medicine, you have the military medicine that is specialized in certain areas. Will there be a closer collaboration, or is that already going on?
I think that it's already going on. And quite frankly, I don't think we can afford for it not to expand and become closer.
Okay.
So often the perspective or the issue is different, but not necessarily. Clearly the science is the science.
Yeah. So. Yeah. We also see a change in warfare, like we said, between World War I, World War II. Now we deal with more let's say, guerrilla warfare, the fact that when you have the forces with boots on the ground, that they are not confronted with an adversary who is organized, who is... so you get this discrepancy between the large number of military forces against small entities, small groups of people that come from all sides. How do you cope with that? How can you prepare for that?
It's definitely not my area of expertise. I'm not a fighting soldier.
And then you say, Wes, you say, run.
Yes, exactly, with the correct technique.
Yeah, there you go.
And as fast as possible.
But is that something that you have to keep in mind, that just not being confronted with forces that are organized like yourself? Is that something that you can prepare?
That brings many aspects, legal aspects. You're not fighting one army against the other army. You're fighting against who knows.
Yeah.
So that's a major strategic problem, not a medical problem, I would say.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a civil guy, so but what I perceive is just like, okay, sometimes we do. But I'm talking as a civil, that we do not know who's the enemy, and if something happens. A couple of months ago, I was supposed to give a talk for the federal parliament in Belgium. It was cancelled because there was kind of viral attack that was then related to. Seems to be something that an incident, and nobody knew exactly where it came from, and to me, that's like a threat I cannot really conceive because it's not my field, but I feel like sometimes an enemy can be invisible, and that feels a bit awkward.
Exactly, it can be totally invisible, and before you know it, it can kill like thousands of people. Before we wrap up today, I would like to have a short reaction from each and every speaker, like a main takeaway of these ICMM Centennial talks, something that you remember from today. Wes, would you like to start?
Yes, I think One social issue in many of the Western countries is that it's very difficult to find men and women that want to be professional soldiers.
Okay.
So we cannot afford to, when 10 people or 100 people volunteer and they say, I want to work for you, we cannot afford to lose them in basic training or in advanced training. We must find ways to get each individual into a specific role in the military so they can contribute.
Yep.
And I think sports medicine can help there.
Absolutely. Focus on the preparation, the physical preparation. Lode, if you can take one thing away from these Centennial Talks, what would it be?
I think we all strive for a better world to live in, and that's what I think I feel we have in common, independently of the discipline we are working in. And I think that's what I appreciate here a lot in this conference.
Okay, thank you very much. General.
Well, I will not answer as a subject matter expert, but as the organizer.
Yeah?
And I've enjoyed that stimulating and almost contagious energy that flew together through those different elements of ceremonial and scientific ingredients, and that thanks to a whole team that was besides and behind me, almost 20 people, the people from the professional congress organizer, the technicians, image, sound, light, our speakers here together, and of course the audience. That made my day. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. For you, one takeaway.
Well, I think a takeaway for me is that when you have health problems that transcend national boundaries, you need to have a global health perspective. And that when we come together to solve global health challenges, that we can succeed better together than we can succeed if we're doing it alone. And that lens shouldn't just deal with global health problems or diseases, it should deal with wellness too. And I see that was a theme through many of the presentations today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. David, for you, a main takeaway.
And I had a very similar feeling. I mean, I think it's, we will be much better working together than apart. And ICMM is an example of how we can do that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, can I have a big round of applause for our guests of today? Lieutenant Colonel Professor Dr. Wes Zimmermann, Professor Lode Godderis, Brigadier General Erwin Dont, Distinguished Professor Steffanie Strathdee, and Dr. David Smith.
Good job, everybody.
General, after all that you have just said, those wonderful compliments for everyone organizing this event, amongst you, yourself, is there anything that you want to add, any messages that you want to still, well, tell our audience?
Well, yes, indeed. I need to remind a couple of messages. First of all, there is that 44th ICMM World Congress that when we are going for the full Monty expected will be held in Brussels, in Belgium next year, 2022, from the 5th till the 9th of September. Remind, registrations are open as of next week, and so also for the abstracts, they can be submitted also as from next week. And besides that, the renewed website, ICMM World Congress 2021.org, will be online as of tomorrow.
So this means, General, that if we say goodbye right now to everyone and to the audience at home, that we will not see or hear them until September next year.
That's not true. Because in the meantime, the ICMM World Congress 2021 wants to keep in touch with you. Indeed, we have a lot in store for you. We'll organize promotional health defense podcasts with bridging content leading up to the event in 2022. Now, we are working at the program, but be aware, watch your agendas, watch the release dates, and register in due time. And besides that, you are kindly invited to follow us on our social media, on Twitter and/or LinkedIn. So don't miss out any of that content.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, General. Thank you for organizing the ICMM Centennial Talks 2021. It was a pleasure being on stage with you. It was a pleasure seeing all the speakers. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end of a very inspiring session. Thank you very much for watching. For those watching at home, thank you for being present in our studio here in Antwerp. We will meet again in Brussels from the 5th until the 9th of September 2022 for the 44th ICMM World Congress. See you then. Bye-bye.